you want to give a little more context from the top, feel free. All right, I guess we're on it.
Okay.
Okay. Good morning. Thank you for joining us in a windowless room on this beautiful day. We appreciate you coming. We're going to talk today about the OER movement and what it can learn from the open source and open access movements, which so far have been much bigger. And I'm joined here by my panelists. We have one remote today. If you can bring up Jenna. Great. Hi, Jenna. This is Jenna Mikowski. She is a senior product manager of Open edX, and her past also has been in this industry working for Alexander Street Press and Coherent Digital, and we're happy to have her join us today from Denver. And then I have Molly Keener, who's with us today from Wake Forest University Library. She's Director of Digital Initiatives and Scholarly Communication. And I am Andrea Eastman Mullins. I'm founder of West End Learning, and we support faculty and colleges making the move to OER, both creating content and adopting it. So we are excited to join you today, and with our many professional hats, we also have a couple open hats today. So Jenna is going to be representing Team Open Source in our conversation today, and Molly is going to represent Team OA, and I'm going to represent Team OER. So we're all going to have that particular perspective, and then during Q&A we might mix it up a bit. So what brought us together is we're all on this open destination. And raise your hand if you're on some sort of open journey in your work. Open access, OER, open source. So a lot of us, and we're all trying to reach this summit. And the summit for us is essentially open equals social good. But how we get there and the path that we take is far from clear, and we're all working that out as we go. And what we've learned in our conversations is that that mix of approaches moving ahead is something we can all learn from. So as open source went first and open access, what are the challenges there and the lessons learned that can help us as we go on the OER path? So we're going to look at that across 5 different themes today. We could be here all week talking open, so we're going to limit it to these things. We're going to talk about the impact and how we measure that in each of these movements, the beneficiaries, who's really benefiting, who's intended to, and maybe who is a side effect beneficiary, and how do we fund this, and what kind of privilege does that, how does that play out in terms of privilege and equity in each of these situations, and what strategies encourage contribution. They all require community involvement. How do we involve the community? And finally, what does the infrastructure look like across these different movements? So I will turn it to Jenna, who is going to kick us off talking about impact in open source.
Great, thanks, Andrea. So I thought I'd start with just a quick word about what the Open edX software is, just to kind of frame the conversation, and then I'll dive a little bit into how we measure impact in the context of open source software, and then specifically about Open edX. So Open edX is an open source teaching and learning platform, and it was designed to build and deliver online courses, initially to deliver MOOCs, massive open online courses. So it's effectively an authoring environment and an LMS, kind of mushed into one. And it is the software that powers over 1,200 instances of open online courses around the world. This includes edX, which is its sort of former parent entity, but it's also used independently by universities, by governments, nonprofits, small businesses, and IGOs like the United Nations to deliver online learning content to learners at scale. And so the first area that we wanted to talk about relative to all of these open movements is impact, right? And what are the goals and metrics that are used to measure impact? So I'll talk specifically about the open source software space. There's 2 angles to measuring impact of open source projects. The first angle revolves more around the goal of the community that supports the open source project. And I think this is a very strong and unique point about open source software, is that there's the goal of having a healthy, diverse, and robust community of contributors to the project. So that's one angle of measuring impact. The second angle revolves more around like the sector-specific goals that are unique to whatever sector that the open source project is serving. So to talk a little bit about that first angle, The success of open source software is really contingent on having an active community. So this is active maintainers of the code base and active contributors to the code base. And the more diverse that community of contributors is, the more robust and sound the project will be. And there's a metaphor that we like to use in ecology, in that a healthy ecosystem is diversified, and the same is true for an open source ecosystem. And so to use the Open edX software as an example, we measure against this goal of a healthy, robust ecosystem with one metric. And for us, that's the metric of the number of core contributors to the project. And so for us, core contributors are community members that have heightened responsibilities and privileges. So they've developed trust in the community to drive the direction of the project, and as such, they have a higher level of responsibilities than around the project. They build this trust and clout by having sustained high-quality contributions to the project over time. And at Open edX, we include not only coders in that community, but also product managers, translators, documentation authors, QA staff, and more. And so a core contributor is basically somebody who has consistently made quality, what we call upstream contributions. Those are contributions that benefit the whole project in the community, not just a single group's instance or use of the code. And so to measure this, Open edX has core contributors from 15 organizations, which I think is important to note because one of the indicators of an unhealthy open source project is where all of the contributors are coming from a single organization. And we call this an elephant project. So it's actually kind of a great question to ask if a company says their project is open source. One indicator of how healthy that open source project is how many different organizations are contributing to it to keep it afloat. So that's sort of one angle of looking at impact in the open source world. The other angle is around measuring impact specific to the sector that the software serves. So open source software is used in hundreds of different sectors. And one question you could ask is, what impact is my project making in that industry? And so in our case at Open edX, we're asking, what impact does Open edX make as an open source learning and teaching platform? And I'll say, off the top, it's really difficult to define and standardize these metrics. This is one of our biggest challenges. For example, we want to use metrics like scale and reach as one way to gauge impact. So we're trying to answer questions like how many instances of Open edX exist around the world? How many learners did they reach? And these questions are not straightforward at all to answer, and that's actually in part due to the nature of open source. The beauty of Open edX is that anyone anywhere can spin up an instance and deliver a course. And that's the challenge as well, right? Anyone anywhere can spin up an instance and deliver a course. On top of that, each instance is using different metrics potentially to measure impact. So some instances may use the number of registrants on the site, while others may use the number of registrants who actually enroll in a course. Some measure course completion, others don't. The list goes on. And so it's our challenge as the stewards of the Open edX project to come up with a way to aggregate and standardize across these instances so that we can have some metrics to look at holistically. One more compounding challenge, which I'm sure will resonate with many of you here, is this broader question of what does it even mean to measure learning to begin with? Completion rates are certainly not sufficient, especially in the world of self-paced online learning. But these are the base metrics that we have to start with, despite being so spotty. And I'll be honest and say we actually don't have a solution here, but this is one of our core goals for the first year that we are in existence as the sort of stewards of this project, is to figure out how we sort of define and measure those metrics around impact. I'll pass it over to, I think, Molly.
Thanks, Jenna. Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Molly Keener. I am at Wake Forest University. I'm talking to you about OA, which I'm going to guess of the three topics today is the one that everyone is the most familiar with. So I'm going to be the one who is speaking the least because I want you guys to, to have the most time hearing from Andrea about OER. As we all know, sort of the impact of the open access movement sort of is twofold, right? We have the scholarly impact and we have the social impact. Within the scholarly impact area, it's for the individual researcher, right? You write the article, you publish it, you write the book chapter, you publish it. More people hopefully are discovering your work, they're reading your work, and in turn that leads to increased citation. We do have documented research that shows that this happens, and that's fantastic. We also have impacts from funders who are saying, this is important. We want to see our funded research. We want to see what we are having you produce and what we're supporting you in doing made publicly available. We know that publisher business models are responding, right? Obviously, we have open access publishers. We have seen flips in publishing among journals and lots of different models for that. The impact with publisher business models sometimes has not been positive, right? Unfortunately, we have seen predatory publishers arise in response to the open access movement, right? They're just sort of hooking in a really dangerous way. And that does make our job as advocates of open access among our scholars more difficult. We also know that the impact in tenure and promotion has been varied across institutions, right? Some institutions are like, what the heck is this? Is this vanity publishing? Is this legitimate? And sadly, this conversation is still happening, 20 plus years into open access in 2022, particularly if you're talking to non-STEM fields. So the scholarly impact, while it has been beneficial and while we are continuing to see that benefit, there have of course been some bumps in the road, and that's true for all of these movements, right? Jenna just mentioned that. You're going to hear a little bit about some challenges with OER as well. On the social side, this sort of social public good impact of open access is a big driver, but it's not one that is as easily definable and measurable, right? Like, we hope that the public are using the research, right? We hope that it's getting out there. We don't actually have a great measure of how far and deep that impact can go. We also hope and know that faculty, staff, and students elsewhere are getting access to research that they maybe otherwise wouldn't. But again, there's not a measurable impact for that. And so while the social justice aspect of open access is very, very good, that's not always the one that resonates as deeply with our scholars, and it's not the one that we can point to as easily to our research office and our provosts and our library deans to say, this is the success, this is the impact. So open access, I think we probably all agree, is good on the whole, but it's not just uniformly positive, everything is going well, we can, check, tick box, and show success every single way. And now I'm going to hand it over to Andrea.
So OER, the main impact here is clearly students. So students spend over, on average, $1,000 a year on commercial textbooks, and over 65% of them don't buy the textbooks, even though they know it will probably impact their grade. So we have issues here of access to education and issues to learning outcomes that are fairly significant. And tuition is obviously a much more expensive thing for students, but for whatever reason, we feel course materials is what we can grab hold of. So it's very student-focused, and when measuring impact of the OER movement, the stats tend to be around student savings. So Spark estimates that $1 billion has been saved globally by moving to OER, that on average when a faculty member uses an OER in a course, it saves students $160 for that course. So that seems very promising. And aggregate studies have looked at our learning outcomes better. And they found that over 85% respond that either OERs are better or equal to the commercial solutions. So those are good metrics to track, but it kind of misses the middle person in all of this. And the middle person who makes OER possible, both creating it and assigning it, is faculty. And so there are some measures out there to try to see, well, how are we doing with faculty? And so Bayview Analytics, previously Babson, has been looking at this. What does faculty adoption look like in OER for several years? And there was a big jump here. Are you using OER in your classroom over COVID? But we're still under a quarter of faculty assigning OER in their courses. And so other faculty are interviewed by saying, well, do you even know about OER? What is your awareness of OER? And that has just gone over 50%. So looking at those kind of statistics, it seems kind of bleak. If we need to save students that much money, are we bringing faculty along fast enough? But in my experience working with faculty at West End Learning, they actually are doing things that don't count as OER. So with all the faculty I speak with, they're either adding open resources to supplement their textbook, or they're completely replacing it with other material. And the best example I could give is I worked with Christina Elson at Wake Forest University, and we took her course and built it completely using free content. So it's not the 5 R's of OER, but she used open videos, she used materials in the library, she used materials she created herself, and the full course is free for students. So if the impact and the goal here is student affordability, what else can we measure besides awareness of OER and use of OER textbooks? So that's something I think as we think about the barriers to faculty in OA and also OER that we might learn from what's come before us. So I will turn now to beneficiaries, who benefits in all these different movements. And Jenna is up to talk open source.
Okay, so who are the intended beneficiaries of open source projects? For open source, I like to think of it as kind of a virtuous circle, in that the project stakeholders are oftentimes also the main beneficiaries of the project. So many open source projects are kept thriving from the contributions that come from the companies or the organizations that are also keeping the software running. Many times these are commercial companies, but not always. It can be government projects. There can be nonprofit organizations contributing as well. But companies will often choose to use open source software because it's often cheaper than using a proprietary platform. So it effectively contributes to their bottom line, which is one way to think about it sustainably. In the case of Open edX specifically, we have engineering managers at the companies that have the core contributors, so the people who are committed to the platform. They'll actually have their teams devote a regular number of hours each month or each sprint to maintaining or to contributing to the code base. And it's in their best interest to contribute to ensuring that the platform is kept up to date and the like, because it's the software that's running their projects or their products that are bringing them revenue. And so at the same time, those contributions are then turning around and keeping the platform healthy and robust and thriving. And I think this is maybe an interesting point of reference to think about between open source and maybe OER, for example, where the intended beneficiaries of OERs, which are effectively the students, have no role really whatsoever in the process of actually creating or maintaining the content. And I'll turn it over to Molly.
So when it comes to the stakeholders and beneficiaries in open access, I could just leave this slide up and say nothing else, because that is actually the intent, right? Is that everyone at some point along the way in different ways, be it direct or indirect, is benefiting from the open access movement, right? The more scholarship that is available, the more easily that knowledge is accessible, it's going to benefit everybody. Of course, we know that the reality is that the primary beneficiaries are our scholars, right? And again, this goes really closely tied to the impact of open access in that you are able to share your work more broadly, your work is more discovered, in turn it is cited more, but also as scholars you get to use and find other people's work that you maybe wouldn't have otherwise, or it would have been a little more cumbersome for you to find it. Same for our students, right? Particularly those who are at less well-resourced institutions that can't have the same number of journal subscriptions that my students at Wake Forest have access to. And we know that this is helping them with their learning, and it also can feed into faculty working on OERs, right? Like there's just more information available for them to be able to pull into their classrooms for their students. Libraries, of course, benefit from this, right? We're able to add more, journals to our catalogs, although I'm not convinced that that's where anyone, faculty or students, find them, right? We all know that that's not how they're getting to the content, but we're able to add it there so that they can see that it is accessible. Ebook collections that are open now certainly can be added as well. And there's benefit to publishers, of course. New business models, it doesn't come, again, without its own challenges, but we have had new publishers rise as open access publishers. We've had other publishers look at how they can adopt open access and change their business model and to their benefit, I would say to our benefit as well. It's not just a distinct sort of you get this benefit and you get that benefit. It really is sort of interrelated across all of us. So, Andrea.
Thanks. So in OER, clearly students are the beneficiaries, but it extends beyond students as well. And faculty, we'll talk about them in a minute, but they can also benefit because it's actually more effective teaching. So instead of delivering a custom curriculum or a set curriculum, they can customize it with their own content, reuse, remix it. That is actually a better pedagogical approach. And by putting some of their work out there, kind of like OA, it can be more discovered, people can learn about their teaching. So there's some significant benefit there for faculty. But for funders too, they're essentially giving aid out to support student access to textbooks. Aid now going to help create OER makes that material open. And that's a better social good in the end. And institutions themselves obviously want to be able to state better student outcomes and also differentiate themselves in a very competitive college landscape by saying, well, come here, it's cheaper to use course materials. But faculty really are the key box there in getting this all to work. Students are on board, everyone else is on board. And I think right now, the burden of OER is a little higher for faculty than the benefit. So if we look at the barriers faculty do face, many studies will show that it's finding relevant content for their course, especially in upper level courses, and mostly it's time. Time to create it, time to adopt it, time to find it. That's certainly what we find working with faculty. And the process is a bit different than a research search. And so searching OER is really not a solution because it's all encompassing. When a faculty member sits down, they have to think, well, does it fit with the context of my course? Is it the right level for my student body? How do I actually teach with this? So it's much more mind consuming than time consuming, which is what I've heard others say. And certainly we see that as well. And that leads to the next topic, which is funding and privilege. So these faculty we are asking to do so much work, a lot of the solution is to fund them with grants. And that sometimes is a very unbalanced approach when you have faculty at community colleges probably receiving less course release time and less grants, even though their students may need the OER more. So we will move into funding and privilege. And Jenna is up to talk open source.
Thanks, Andrea. So I think the open source world is a little bit different from what Andrea just mentioned around OER and grant funded projects in that most open source, or a lot of open source software is not grant funded. Like I just described, companies have incentives to contribute and maintain the code base because it impacts their bottom line. That being said, though, there's it's never quite so black and white. A lot of open source projects are stewarded by some sort of umbrella nonprofit or foundation. One example is the Linux Foundation. At Open edX, we are stewarded by a nonprofit called the Center for Reimagining Learning. All that being said, though, I'd argue that open source projects have the capacity to be quite self-sustaining because of that nature of companies contributing, and it's actually tied to their planning and to their quarterly revenue goals, oftentimes. And again, the more diverse the ecosystem of contributors is to an open source project, the healthier and more sustainable the project is. There's a little bit of a nuanced downside that I want to mention from my perspective as a product manager of an open source learning project, teaching and learning platform. The more robust an open source project is, the more amorphous it can be at the same time, in that it can support a wide range of use cases. And those use cases may or may not be related to each other. They may even be at odds with each other to a certain degree. And this makes it really difficult from a product management perspective to make decisions about where to invest in the project, how to tie feature development to market needs and market feedback. As a concrete example with Open edX, Open edX was originally built to deliver MOOCs, so massive open online courses, at large scale. So we're talking learners in the millions. It's been creatively expanded over the years by some folks, some organizations to meet other needs and other use cases. So for example, some feature development to serve the needs of an on-campus LMS, for example, or smaller face-to-face or hybrid courses. Those are two very different feature sets for one platform. And so this diverse spectrum of use cases makes it sometimes challenging to craft a clear product narrative. Whereas other companies may have, a clear set of use cases that they're investing in and that they're developing features around. But I think this is just one of those challenges that comes with shared governance. And if you develop a project, correctly, you can sort of subsume the various different use cases with one or two different strategic plans. So I think the benefits outweigh the challenges far, at the end of the day. Molly, funding and privilege and open access.
So Andrea just a moment ago said that there's a lot of sort of unbalanced issues within OER, and I think that's true within open access as well. There's a lot of the haves and the have-nots, and I'm not going to spend time talking about the haves. I think we're pretty familiar with that, with the exception of saying that, those who have funding can often pay to play in Gold OA, and unfortunately there is that sort of assumption that Gold OA is better somehow. And I do not believe that is true, but particularly among some faculty, it sort of has that sort of gravitas to it. And that creates a challenge, right, for those who don't have funding, be it grant funding, be it institutional open access publishing funds, be it even at an institution that has a read and publish agreement that supports our faculty publishing openly. And so when we think about the funding and privilege in open access, I tend to think more about those who don't have that same funding and privilege and where we need to do work to improve that, right? So, one area that I don't feel that we were talking about enough, and this goes hand in hand with OER often, are the institutions that are less well-resourced but in well-resourced countries. So they're not in geographic regions that publishers automatically exempt waivers for if someone's publishing Gold OA, right? It might be our smaller institutions here in the United States that are liberal arts colleges where faculty aren't expected to do a lot of publishing, if any, but faculty may still want to do that, right? They may not have any grant funding. They may not have institutional funding. Those libraries right now often aren't actually doing read and publish or transformative agreements with publishers. And so the deck is a little bit stacked against the faculty at those institutions for fully participating in open access. And those institutions are often the same ones where students are facing the textbook cost challenges that Andrea's been talking about. And so that's where some of the disproportion and unequalness within the OA circle is directly tied to OERs. Andrea?
Thanks. Yeah, I think there's a lot that OER can learn from OA in this section for sure. And OER faces some pretty serious headwinds here in the funding space because essentially you're taking an $8 billion textbook industry that students have funded and trying to get someone else to pay to create this content. So there's a big question mark on how we get to that summit. Who is paying for this? And there's many different models in play. So institutions are taking budget to give grants to faculty to recreate open courses. Foundations are giving a lot of money, a lot of donations to OpenStax, which we'll talk about in a minute. Government funding is significant in many different countries, especially in the US as of late, and some faculty are self-funding this work. So I'm going to give a few examples of where faculty have seen a need and just created it and funded it themselves. But the inertia of what has happened comes back to students a lot more than you would think. So there's homework systems that still integrate open content, but they're charging students on a per student basis to use them. That may be okay, it's less money, but it still puts it back on the student. We'll talk about inclusive access, where students are paying up front for their curriculum when they pay their tuition. So there's still a lot of student payment going on in the OER movement. But it is positive, at least within our country so far, of the movement toward open. And we could see the recent decisions in OA too. I think this will only continue. So the US government has funded over 17 million in the creation of open textbooks so far. And many different states have policies specifically. And this is up on Spark's website. And it dynamically changes with whatever's going on in your state. But publishers have found a different way of charging students, and that is the inclusive access component. And that does save students costs, so they pay for their course materials up front with their tuition, and so then they have them on day one of their class. But in the OER movement, it's seen as being pretty bad. So this is Rajiv Jhangiani. He is a psychology professor and maybe the most outspoken advocate of OER and how bad inclusive access is. And so I love this quote because it shows the danger of repositioning things in the market to support commercial initiatives, but it also shows, for lack of a better word, I would say the hatred against commercial entities in this space. And as we'll talk about in a minute with infrastructure, I think we need everyone. We need everyone to solve the challenges of OER. And so there's a dynamic there with inclusive access that's interesting to follow. So let us move to contribution strategies. How do we get people to participate and contribute in these different movements? Jenna is up with open source.
So contribution in open source is pretty straightforward. An open contribution to a project may consist of a whole range of various activities, which kind of levels the playing field and enables anybody to hop in at any given level. A contribution may be as simple as reviewing somebody else's code contribution. It can be actually contributing a new feature code upstream so that anybody who's in this community with the platform can use it or can evolve on it or build on it. Contributing can be just as simple as answering questions on forums or contributing to project documentation. Open source projects revolve around documentation. Everything is documented. Keeping those documents updated is a huge task, and so that's a great way for people to contribute to projects. Contributing can also be doing things like chairing working groups. The OpenEdX platform is driven by about 8 or 9 different working groups who all focus on various parts of the platform. They meet bi-weekly. And so the rewards for contributing really on any level, especially within using OpenEdX as an example, are that you have the opportunity to become that core contributor. So the more you contribute over time, the more trust you gain with the community. And this means that over time you can have more responsibilities for you and your organization, and that ultimately means that you have more clout then to drive the strategic direction of the project and the project roadmap. Molly.
So the contribution strategies to open access are varied, right? And they come from different directions. You'll note that I do funders, publishers, and institutional, and I don't put in faculty and libraries, and that's because faculty and libraries are engaged in all of those different ways throughout. We're all quite familiar with all of these. I put funders at the top intentionally because a lot of times money drives everything, right? And we have seen the funders say, you want the grant, you need to do this, and faculty are like, okay, I want the grant. And so that creates that beneficial cycle in that way. I intentionally want to call out the other sort of open scholarship that is happening at our institutions that does not fall under the sort of assumed open access umbrella, and that is the scholarship that our digital humanists and digital scholarship faculty are doing, right? They are creating these really gorgeous, incredible, rich projects that live online, that are dynamic and inherently open. And we don't necessarily count that as part of open access, right? But it is happening, and a lot of times they are relying on things that are open. They're definitely relying on open source to build these projects. And that's just something that at your institution, if you are a librarian, I would challenge you to think about who is doing this work and how you can engage them in your conversations about open, how you can engage with them talking about open source, but also talking about what could this look like in the classroom? How could it come in as an OER? How could students maybe engage to build an OER? There's this whole area happening that we just don't always acknowledge, and that is a very valuable contribution that we need to be bringing into these conversations as well.
Yeah, building on that, in OER, of course, faculty need to assign it, but they also need to create it. And here they're facing some pretty serious headwinds on the hike. So generally, teaching and learning is not recognized in tenure and promotion, so there's not as much reward in the promotion process to create teaching content. And when they do, they're expecting some kind of royalty on the other side. And in OER, there is no promise of royalty. And of course, it takes an enormous amount of time to do. So it's a serious challenge to get faculty engaged. OpenStax has been quite successful. They have 40 books, and they're in 60% of higher education institutions currently. And their model is that they pay faculty up front to contribute. And they say, well, look, there's no guarantee of royalty on the other side if you go commercial, but we can guarantee you an upfront payment. So it does involve more faculty in the process, but it's still quite time-consuming. This peer review process comes from the textbook world, and it's very thorough, highly peer-reviewed content, but it also takes sometimes 2 to 3 years and a cost of up to $18,000 to create a textbook. So what I find faculty doing are creating their own paths forward. And I'm very interested in this because it shows us the future of what teaching is and what will engage them more organically. And I see them creating things that are modular, open, and much cheaper to create. So 3 examples of faculty I work with. Dr. J has a Real Talk channel on YouTube talking about entrepreneurship for students, and it goes with an open source textbook that he uses in his class. Rebecca White at the University of Tampa has an entire website dedicated toward creating podcasts and organizing them for use in teaching. And the Neurosurgical Atlas was formed by a neurosurgeon who felt the need to teach detailed surgical techniques to other neurosurgeons, filmed his own surgeries, and paid to put them up online himself. So there's a lot of very interesting things coming out. And in the recent survey, too, from Ithaca, and faculty have used video lectures twice as more times, created them twice as more as open textbooks. So we can see that the content being created is actually quite different than a full-scale textbook. How can we include and recognize these as significant contributions to contributing to affordable learning? We're going to breeze through infrastructure so we can have a few minutes for questions. So Jenna, I'll turn it over to you.
Sure. So infrastructure on open source, I think, is also pretty straightforward. Open source projects are self-governing, and so we use a lot of formal documents to sort of drive frameworks for decision-making and for workflows and processes. Another central tool that we use is GitHub. GitHub is a hosting service for software development and version control, and it's basically where all of the coders code. The interesting thing about GitHub, though, to me that's relevant to this open conversation is that it tracks adaptation and changes at really granular levels. So even the most inconsequential change to the code base is like forever noted in the code's history. Version control is basically built in by design. Another interesting thing is that GitHub is designed to foster collaboration, especially for reviewing code. Basically, any change that's proposed to the code base has to go through a review process. So there's basically like peer review built into the workflow by design as well. And I think these 2 interesting things, like the version controlling on content and the peer review process, are interesting to inform conversations about creation of content in the OA and the OER space. Molly?
So again, I dare say we're all familiar with open access infrastructure, right? We sort of know that there's the forward facing, and it can be publishing or it can be depositing or sharing, on a website or in another way. We have built on others, right? No need to invent the wheel. So it is out there, there's back-end infrastructure that happens as well, right? What we are doing to support our scholars at our institutions, what our research offices are doing, what the libraries are doing. And it's important to not discount that sort of backside infrastructure support that we are offering as institutions because we focus so much on the forward-facing infrastructure.
And in the interest of time, I'll leave the OER piece with this slide. We really are trying to recreate an infrastructure that had existed with textbook publishers and bookstores. And so naturally, it's a very early stage. There are over 70 collections of OERs that you can search online. There's over 200 fields of unstructured metadata. And doing a search for LibGuides, mentioning the word OER, there's 39,000 of them. So navigating this is very difficult, despite efforts, but it's very early stage. And discipline-specific curations tend to be really taking hold. So I see a lot of activity here in societies, faculty-oriented groups, pulling content together with the context of teaching. But I want to get to lessons for OER. That's why we're all here. So what can we learn? And with whatever time we have left, I'm going to ask you that question. But what we came up with was, what counts as a contribution in OER? Molly mentioned in OA, there's a lot of open access materials out there. How can we count them, recognize them, and invite faculty with us on that journey, and even fund some of them with some of the money? There's significant issues of haves and have-nots in the OER space, particularly supporting faculty. And again, our summit is we want to save students money, but a lot of this burden is falling on faculty who also have time and financial challenges of their own. And often in those situations, their students need the benefit the most. Student involvement. This is a great lesson from open source. The beneficiaries that Jenna mentioned are the ones creating open source content, which makes it sustain itself. And so how can students get involved? They can help support faculty on campus creating OER. They can do work-study programs. The whole field of open pedagogy deliberately involves students in content creation as part of their coursework. And there's so much funding currently going into textbook creation. Is that really the mode that faculty need going forward? Is that going to be of highest use? Is that going to naturally engage them in creating teaching and learning content? What if we move some of that to different content forms or to support an infrastructure? And finally, I would say that in the open source and the open access movements, it's an environment that includes all sorts of players. Scholarly associations, libraries, institutions, and commercial entities. But I don't see that kind of thing going on in OER. And what are we missing without including that? Are there new emerging commercial ideas that could support these really big problems, like faculty involvement in infrastructure? How can we think differently about that to get there? So I will end with your thoughts and questions. There are mics on either side. If you could go there and share, I believe we have 30 seconds left. I am certainly happy to stay and answer any questions that you may have. Yes.
From Copyright Clearance Center, all irony noted, doesn't sound very open, but actually I have a lot of OER experience in the K-12 space where we're a semi-commercial partner, however you want to define us, I'm not going to get into that, where we actually worked with the state of Louisiana to help them meet their OER goals around English language arts, which because of state standards needed to have copyrighted material integrated within the course without sort of destroying all the benefits of OER. So I'm going to make a shameless plug for an article that is open access that I co-wrote in UKSG Insights, talking about some of the challenges that we found in the K-12 space around OER and how to ameliorate some of those for people who are interested, again, at the lower levels, because we really don't focus on higher ed in this, but everything from dead links to, you know, copyrighted material to sustainability on an ongoing basis, which is one of the reasons the commercial players, you know, frankly, frustrating to some of the funders that they fund something and then it's done and then it doesn't sustain itself because the grant goes away. A lot of conversations we've had around that. So I just if people are interested in K-12, take a look at this. My name is Roy Kaufman. You can Google UKSG Insights. My name, I co-authored this with a colleague, and it talks about our experience there. So, and thank you for this, because the more we talk, the closer we're going to get to the goal. So.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for sharing that, Roy. Yeah, I think the K through 12 space is another interesting layer of this to look at. I think they're a little further along in OER, and there's some different challenges there as well, but that's also an interesting place to get new ideas. Thank you. Oh, yes.
Yeah, hi. Kia ora, my name is Adam Hyde from COCO. We develop purely open source platforms for scholarly publishing, OER, etc. I guess my question is, I mean, I think what open source has is a business model, and open access and open education resources don't, right? There's a mix, things are emerging, and it's largely funding driven. But what I'm seeing is that there's actually efforts like Invest in Open that are driving to actually ask libraries for money to build open source software. And I'm just wondering what your thoughts are about, how much pressure this puts in the system, because also a lot of folks are looking to libraries to also fund content development. And so I guess we're all asking questions about, how this all works and how a business model might emerge and where libraries might play a part, but also, who should be asking for money, I guess.
You want to take that one? As librarian?
So I think that we are getting there. We still have a ways to go, right? We need to have these conversations. I think historically, particularly with open access, the institutional funding for it has fallen disproportionately on libraries, and it cannot, right? We need our provost office, we need our research offices to recognize that this is actually to the institution's benefit. This is not something that the libraries can sustain as far as funding goes. How we incentivize that, right? Like, and I mean incentivize within our institutions, right? How we convince our administration that this is beneficial is a challenge for all of this, right? For OER, for open access, for open source. I wish I had like the answer. I think what we are seeing with the experiments, and I'm intentionally using experiment here, with read and publish agreements, with transformative agreements, are getting us closer, but it's an incremental process and it's an iterative process, and we will continue to grow, and OER is just a little bit behind on that, but again, we're seeing that sort of growth trajectory with fits and starts and, the challenges and lessons learned. That's the best I can say. But I do see us moving forward, right?
Yeah, and I think that is, on our path up the mountain. We're all going different paths on that, and I think recognizing that and talking openly about it and charting new courses is the way to go. Anyone else? Yeah, if you could go to a mic, or I'll repeat it if you want. Okay.
Hi, Dione, also from COCO Foundation. I just wanted to add on to the question of business models. One that I've seen work in this space, in the higher education space in the UK, is when you have a group of faculty, actually spearheaded from one university there, but from faculty across the world, focused on a particular topic area, in this case economics, and that group created a textbook that was open access online, but they partnered with a UK publisher to produce the print book. And so combining those groups together, they were still able to satisfy a publisher in terms of making a profit. They were still able to reach a very wide audience as an open online textbook. And I think the prestige around having faculty from across the world focused on economics made a a big impact in terms of motivation.
You want to speak to that?
Thank you for that example. I have a similar example of a faculty member at my institution who has just entered into a contract with a publisher for sort of a print on demand and through the publisher ebook, but also have the open access version. I think these are great. Funding them is still the challenge, right? We have an open access fund at our institution that is co-sponsored by the library and the research office, which is really fabulous that we have them in on that agreement with us. And we are funding this faculty member because he doesn't have grant funding. So I agree that that is a great thing. I think the funding is still the challenge. And of course, in your example, when there's multiple institutions involved, that does help distribute that cost, right? But there's still, for my faculty member, a $13,000 charge to be able to publish his work open access.
Well, thank you all for coming. I want to give you time to get to your next session. If you still have questions, we are around. And of course, we will redo this virtually in a few weeks. So feel free to join us then. Thank you all for coming.